Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses as well for their being here and their testimony. In today's Post, Danielle Pletka, and I believe I'm pronouncing that name right, has a piece in there, pretty compelling piece, and the writer talks about this, at least what they believe the administration has kind of resigned themselves to a nuclear-armed Iran and moving in a direction of a, quote, containment policy. I would like to get your reactions to the premise of the piece, and then also kind of moving into what Ms. Wright pointed out in her opening statements, if in fact that is the case, that this containment policy is what's being pursued, the implications that has for our country to support the reform or democracy movement that's in Iran. And so we can just go down the list and you can fire away. Or we can start with Dr. Moore.
I would disagree that the administration at this stage has settled on containment. I think that really belies everything that has been done, particularly the very creative and positive proposals that were put forward and originally agreed to by the Iranians to export the LEU and support the Tehran research reactor deal. So I just don't see that evidence. I think that we need to be planning for that eventuality simply because we can't predict the way these sorts of things play out. As we learned from both India and Pakistan, there may be drivers that force this regime to move forward more quickly, that in fact produce a nuclear-armed Iran more quickly than we anticipate, and we should be prepared for containment if and when that comes. That needs to be done quietly and discreetly, but that I would hope that planning is already underway. I do not see that as in any way in contrast or undercutting the very strenuous diplomacy that we've had, resetting the relationship with Russia, putting forward serious proposals toward the Iranians, and actually I think very quietly mobilizing at least some international support for the kinds of multilateral sanctions that would be effective. Because I think no one on this panel has said that sanctions should never be used, but simply that they need to be used only where and how that they are most effective. In terms of how that coordinates with our support for the Iranian opposition, I would say quite frankly that the Iranian opposition is a force that we neither created nor anticipated, and our support, while important because we are a moral leader, because we have a certain responsibility given our history, given our ideals, to voice those sorts of ideas, our support is not going to be what changes the future for the Iranian opposition. Iran is a proud country that resents the interference of foreigners very deeply. 50 years later, they still deeply resent, as one of the other representatives suggested, the involvement with the Mossadegh affair in '53. I don't believe at this stage that anything other than moral support for the opposition would be useful or welcomed from that side, and I do believe that that opposition, in fact, will succeed over time simply because it represents the view of the large swath of the Iranian people.
Lopez.
Thank you. It's a very, very important question. I detect through dealing with people in the National Security Council and elsewhere no resignation to the containment strategy. And in fact, I believe that the good example here is the way we're dealing with the North Korea nuclearization problem. That is, we're going to find every diplomatic and in the North Korean case, sanctions-based way to roll this back. So I detect a strategy that on the one hand, counter to where I think we've been for the last decade, rejects the notion that there's an immediacy to the ability to apply increased pressure and then somehow arm twist the Iranians into changing their behavior. The new realism I detect in town now is that we know we're dealing with a very determined regime which has domestic, cultural, and other reasons to move only straight ahead with nuclear development. Now, how do we show them that that's a choice that has consequences without immediately imposing penalties? How do we hold before them a vision of be careful what you wish for when you get it as you deal in your neighborhood and as you deal in the rest of the global community? How do we find a way for them to match their own rhetoric with a responsible participation in the global community's concerns about nuclearization? I think the contingencies will be there for dealing with this, but I like the notion that this current approach sees a very, very long road ahead, and if the measures we don't take result in the desired turning back away from the program and an export of uranium, if they go nuclear, we have models for which to deal with that, as we've executed in Libya and in North Korea. That is, in a sense, you're playing, if you excuse the sports analogy, we have a game plan as long as we're in regulation time, and we have a game plan if we have to go to overtime.
I don't have much to add except that containment is the end of the process and we're still at the beginning.
Well, I think, first of all, you have to understand, it's perfectly logical for Iran to be pursuing nuclear weapons. They're surrounded by other nuclear powers. And they're at a level of sophistication and capability which allows them to achieve a nuclear capability. If Barack Obama or George W. Bush were elected president of Iran, they would be pursuing a nuclear capability. Any leader in that geopolitical context would be. The question is, how can you, first of all, move toward a regime that's not threatening its neighbors ideologically or in others so that people are more relaxed about it, and secondly, create incentives and disincentives that persuade them that a nuclear capability is not in their interest. We've already seen North Korea cross a nuclear threshold, and the current policies are to roll it back. And there are fairly massive sanctions that are in place, and also some fairly substantial inducements that are being offered to try to roll that back. So Iran crossing the nuclear threshold is not necessarily the end of the world, and it doesn't mean, even if it happens, that you're going to live with it indefinitely or try to live with it indefinitely. One of the reasons for, as I've said, for substantial and mounting sanctions against Iran is to persuade other countries they don't want to do the same thing. And so keeping Iran in its pariah status, even if it achieved nuclear weapons or nuclear capability, would be sound policy, in my judgment. So I don't think we should see an absolute deadline here. That said, we're not going to physically prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons by anything short of invasion and occupation. Bombing might delay it, but not indefinitely. Therefore, we're going to have to continue to pursue a track which involves mounting sanctions, continued engagement, and international solidarity in an effort to arrest, slow, or eventually, if necessary, roll back this program.